Welcome to Light On, Light Through, episode 416. My review of Beatles Anthology, the 2025 edition, up now on Disney Plus. Well, my wife and I watched the renewed and expanded Beatles Anthology on Disney Plus the past 3 nights. I'd seen and heard bits and pieces of various lengths of the original 8 episodes. That was back in 1995. And I listened to those bits and pieces on YouTube, the Beatles channel on Sirius XM radio, and everything in between. Now, again, that was originally on ABC TV back in 1995, but we somehow had managed not to have seen that original on the unsmart TV in our family room all those years ago. So it was more than wonderful to see and hear what the 2025 director, Oliver Murray, did with the 1995 8 episodes, uncovering and discovering new footage, as well as calling upon Peter Jackson and his elves to bring to current, vibrant life what was done back in 1995, just as Jackson had done so miraculously with the Beatles' Get Back in 2021. But you know, the real treat for me, and treat is too weak a word here, was seeing the new 9th episode that was added to the Beatles Anthology. So I'll go over some of the highlights of the first 8 episodes for you and then delve into the wonders of the 9th episode and the one problem I had with it. So let's start with those first 8 episodes. First, it was great to see Murray the K get his due, just as he had in Martin Scorsese's Beatles 64 last year. You know, I worked with Murray the K when he was at WNBC Radio in New York City in the 1970s. He hired me after he read my article, Murray the K in Nostalgia's News. By the way, I didn't come up with that title. The Village Voice put that title in there. But that was the second article I had published in the Village Voice. It was published in 1972, as I just said. My first article ever published, by the way, and that was also published in the Village Voice. That first article was, believe it or not, a vote for McCartney. That's the title of the article. That was published a year earlier in 1971. It was my response to the dyspeptic critic Robert Christgau's attack on Paul and his early post-Beatles work. Now, getting back to Murray the K, he never got the credit he deserved back then in ushering in the Beatles, and before then on WINS with Alan Freed, the father of rock radio, or rock and roll as they called it then, and after when Murray was on WOR-FM, helping to invent the FM radio format. I had such a good time working with Murray on NBC, I even wrote and recorded a song about him. Murray the K's back in town. And by the way, I'll have a link to the full version of that song, that recording, in the show notes of this episode. And I was thrilled when Murray played that on the air on NBC Radio. By the way, the late Pete Fornatale, who, as some of you may know if you've read my most recent novel, It's Real Life, An Alternate History of the Beatles, well, Pete Fornatale is the protagonist in that novel, and he played Murray the K's Back in Town on his mixed bag on WFUV Radio, that's Fordham University's radio station. It's an NPR station, And Pete played that song, Murray the K's Back in Town, back in the early 2010s. But let's get back to the anthology. Next thing I really want to mention is how much I enjoyed. I hadn't seen such great shots of the Beatles ever before, and these shots were just wonderful of their performance in the 1964 Washington, D.C. concert. Next, tragically, there was a specter, a foreshadowing of what would happen to John at the end of 1980. George worries throughout about the exposure of the Beatles in a country, our country, the United States, in which John F. Kennedy had just been assassinated. And I'll just mention that sick devotion to guns in this country is still claiming lives. John himself notes after the Washington, D.C. concert that, quote, some bloody animal cut Ringo's hair. That almost sounds funny, but attacking a person physically in any way is not the least bit funny. Next point, on a different matter, but of course related to the Beatles, watching this wonderful, magical documentary, I was reminded once again what a uniquely, almost extraterrestrial person Ed Sullivan was. I mean, there's no one here on earth who had his delivery or his accent. Even in Japan, the Beatles are, of course, introduced in Japanese, and the host concludes in English with, ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles, delivered in a pretty good mimic of Ed. Actually, a lot better than my impression that I just gave you of Ed Sullivan. Moving on in those first 8 episodes, I find it hard to believe that Penny Lane didn't go to #1 in the UK. Beaten out by Engelbert Humperdinck's Release Me? Maybe if it was Les Bicyclettes de Belsize. Continuing on in this review of those 8 episodes, John, after the Beatles had broken up and at odds with Paul, objects in these interviews that took place in the 1970s. John objects to Sgt. Pepper being called a, quote, concept album. John says Mr. Kite and all the songs on the album, other than the Peppers, the one at the beginning, the one near the end, could easily have been on any other Beatles LP. And George also critiques Sgt. Pepper in this segment. Now, as far as I'm concerned, I think Sgt. Pepper is indeed a concept album, and I think what John says is also true. Meaning, I don't think there's a contradiction here. Both are true. And I'll also say how happy I was to find the following poster in an antique shop my wife and I were in. That must have been the late 1970s. It's hanging on a wall outside our bedroom. Every time I walk by it, I smile. It reminds me of Sgt. Pepper. And I'll have a link to that poster in the show notes. In fact, what I'll do in the show notes to this episode is I'll have a link to my written review of the Anthology 2025 documentary. And in that review, you'll actually see that poster. It's a poster, I don't know, I think from the 1840s for Lestock, Fete of the Hermitage. Anyway, you'll see it. And I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. It's at the very top. It says fourth night of Auber's AUBER''S new grand opera! Exclamation point. Now let's get to the new 9th episode. It was not only heartwarming, to see the three surviving Beatles making such superb music, which we see them doing and hear in the ninth episode. It, of course, was also heartbreaking because now George is gone. And it was chock full of fascinating and important information. I think my favorite example I had always heard regarding the genesis of Free as a Bird, Real Love, and Now and Then that the transformation projects began when Yoko Ono gave Paul a tape with some of John's demo recordings from the 1970s. But in episode 9 of Anthology, George tells us about a crucial preface. When Roy Orbison died, the traveling Wilburys were thinking of taking some of Elvis's demos and bringing them to life with the inimitable Wilbury voices. But the Wilburys decided not to go in that direction because, in George's words, it was, quote, too gimmicky, unquote. Now, George didn't say, but rumor has it that the Wilburys were thinking of inducting Del Shannon into the group, but he took his life in 1990. But if I had to pick my favorite moment in the ninth episode, and therefore all 9 episodes of this beautifully burnished anthology, it would be Paul and George completing their incomparable 3-part Beatles harmony with John's voice in the chorus of Real Love. It's been one of my favorite Beatles songs since I first heard it in the mid 1990s. And you know, the song inspired me to write my novel, my most recent novel. It's Real Life and Alternate History of the Beatles. And by the way, also in the show notes, there'll be a link to Anne Reburn's fabulous cover of the song. She performed this song in the radio play broadcast on Kilowatt Radio, adopted from the first chapter of my novel. And there'll be a link in the show notes to that radio play as well. By the way, Real Life was actually John's title for the song before he changed it to Real Love. Now, Paul and George's voices being in such sync with John's recording, the harmony snapping into place, snapping into life, is a deeply acoustic proof to me that this uniquely satisfying sound will never die. At that instant, the former Beatles became the Beatles again and gave evidence that the Beatles will always be with us. You know, powers that be often miss the immortality of what is all around them. After Marshall McLuhan died in 1980, same year and month, by the way, as John, their lives were intertwined. They both hit America big in 1964. But after McLuhan died in December 1980, I proposed a book about him to an editor at St. Martin's Press. He laughed and told me no one cared about McLuhan anymore. That book became my digital McLuhan, which Routledge published in 1999. Routledge, a lot more intelligent a publisher than St. Martin's Press. You know, I still receive royalty checks for sales of that book every single year. In the 1970s, I told my doctoral thesis advisor, Neil Postman, that I thought the Beatles, like Shakespeare, would be known and enjoyed for as long as there were human beings. Neil Postman laughed too. Which brings me to the one criticism I have about episode 9 of this fabulous documentary. Paul and Ringo are still alive. Yes, The Beatles' music, including their harmonies, will live forever, but not the mortals, not the mortal beings who made it. Wouldn't it have been wonderful to have had another hour, even just a few minutes, to have Paul and Ringo look back at 1995 from their vantage point right now? Oliver Murray, of course, interviewed Paul and Ringo in the short film he made, Now and Then, the Last Beatles Song, that accompanied release of the single in 2023. I guess that could be considered a coda to Anthology 2025, a coda that was made and put together before the actual 9-part documentary was made. But wouldn't a few more words from Paul and Ringo looking back at what they accomplished in 1994 when Free as a Bird was made and 1995 when Real Love was made, wouldn't a few words from them now have been just the perfect cup of sencha tea after the marvel everyone who has seen that documentary took in? Chris Williams asked Oliver Murray in an excellent interview in Variety. I'll have a link to that interview also in the show notes. Williams asked Murray why there are no contemporary 2025 voices in episode 9. Murray replies, quote, I didn't really like the idea of Ringo and Paul in 2025 talking about an interview that he gave in 1995 about something that happened in 1965. It was all too nebulous to do that, unquote. Now, I gotta tell you, I'm not sure I know what, quote, too nebulous, unquote, means in this context. That is, I think I disagree.
The Light on Light Through podcast.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that review of Anthology 2025. If you've ever enjoyed anything from the Beatles, I would highly, highly recommend that documentary. It's beautiful, it's wonderful, it's inspiring. Yes, it is heartbreaking, and it's well worth your seeing. And I'll be back here soon with another episode of Light On, Light Through. Could be an interview, could be another review. You know, I haven't done too many reviews recently. I have so many interesting people I need to interview, so I'm not sure what it will be, but it will be coming soon. In the meantime, stay safe, stay sound, and enjoy.
The Light on Light Through podcast.
Athens, 2042 AD. She ripped the paper in half, then ripped the halves, then ripped what was left again into bits and pieces of history that could have been. Sierra Waters had read once that, years ago, it was thought that men made love for the thrill, while women made love for the sense of connection it gave them.
Curled Up with a Good Book says, Sierra Waters is sexy as hell. You can find out more about The Plot to Save Socrates by Paul Levinson at theplot2savesocrates.com.
Your brilliant story, it's real life.
Paul Levinson's Silk Code, about an ancient biotech war raging on in secret for centuries.
Reading words from